Hello, this is Dr. James Strickler, and this is a course in United States history. This lecture deals with Chapter 22, The New Era, in the United States history textbook, American Yawp. Now, the title of this chapter, The New Era, I think is a little misleading. It deals with a time period that's more commonly referred to as the Roaring Twenties, or sometimes as the Age of Jazz. This is a time period in which Americans felt in some ways liberated from the more conservative lifestyle of decades past. They had just fought in the First World War, and now people wanted a release of sorts. But this is a time period in which alcohol was prohibited by Prohibition, and so they found releases in other ways. This was a change in culture, like for example seen in this picture. You have women wearing shorter skirts than they had in the past, behaving in ways that they may not have behaved also. People looked for outlets to express their individuality during this time, to take advantage of changing things in society. Modernity was happening. We were getting new inventions, new ways of thinking, and this was a time period when those things were celebrated. Interestingly, during this time period, it was primarily a time when the Republican Party controlled Congress, and particularly the White House, with a string of presidential victories. At the beginning of the decade, a man named Warren G. Harding was elected president. Harding campaigned on a return to normalcy, which there is some irony in him getting elected on that pledge at the beginning of the Roaring Twenties, when society went through drastic sorts of changes. But the normalcy that he was referring to was the time period of the First World War, when America had suddenly moved out into the world in an aggressive foreign policy way. We'd got ourselves in a world conflict, and at the same time we had endured a giant pandemic, the influenza pandemic, commonly known as the Spanish flu, which had swept around the globe. It had been a time of great suffering and great sacrifice for the American people. Now, as the 20s got started, Warren G. Harding promised to return to normalcy, and the people liked that, and they elected him with that in mind. But his presidency was not normal. It was one of the most corrupt in American history. Now, this doesn't mean that he personally was a criminal, that he was personally corrupt. What it means is that he surrounded himself with people who were corrupt. Many of these people were members of what was known as the Ohio Gang. This is a group of hangers-on, people that had sort of ridden on his coattails as he had risen politically through his home state of Ohio and eventually to the presidency. In our modern language, we might refer to these as his posse, the kind of people that you see when someone becomes a celebrity in entertainment or sports, and they bring their friends from the old neighborhood with them, who then live off of their money and oftentimes get in trouble. They get in trouble because they are enjoying the fruits of something they did not earn, and so they don't act nearly as responsible with it. Well, Warren G. Harding had a similar crowd that followed him through his political rise. And when he got into the presidency, he gave sweet jobs to these friends of his, including as members of his presidential cabinet. And they took advantage of that to enrich themselves. The most scandalous of the events that took place in his presidency was the Teapot Dome scandal. Now, this involved a place in Wyoming where there was a giant reserve of oil called the Teapot Dome. And what happened was several members of his administration were in charge of seeing how that oil supply would be utilized. And what they did was they entered into agreements with oil companies, giving them access to that land to pump the oil out and make profits off of it. In exchange for that, the oil companies made illegal payments to these officials. So they were enriching themselves by the sale of these public lands filled with oil. Well, eventually this was found out, and some of them were convicted and sent to prison. These are the kind of people that Harding had surrounded himself with, making his presidency far from a return to normalcy, but a scandal-filled time. But it wouldn't last for long. Within a couple years, Harding dropped dead from a heart attack, and his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, took over as president of the United States. Calvin Coolidge was not surrounded by similarly corrupt people, and his administration actually brought some normalcy back in that sense. Calvin Coolidge was a man that believed greatly in the powerful, positive work that businesses could do. He even was quoted as saying the chief business of the American people is business. He thought that to have a healthy and prosperous country, that government should get out of the way of businesses to allow them to thrive. Calvin Coolidge's attitude about business can be seen in this interesting photo. As President of the United States, he had an opportunity to meet just about anyone that he wanted. And here he's posing for a photo he's on the left with his father farther to the left. He's there with his father. And they are posing with Henry Ford, nearest to him on the right, and Thomas Edison, the great inventor. So two of the greatest businessmen from this time period are here in this photo with the President of the United States. It showed how much he valued the enterprise and innovation that came from the business world. With this in mind, one of his big moves as a president was to reduce the top tax rate on the wealthiest earning Americans. It dropped from 66% to 20%. Now what that means is, prior to this rate reduction, if you were some multimillionaire in the United States and you made an extra dollar, you would have had to pay 66 cents of that dollar to the national government. Now when you add in what you might have to pay in taxes to your state and to your locality, at the end you have very little money left of that dollar. So Calvin Coolidge's thought was, if we keep that tax rate high, we reduce the incentive for these powerful entrepreneurs, these powerful innovators who get businesses going, to go out and earn more money. And if they're not trying to earn more money, then they're not going to be trying to employ additional people. They aren't going to be driving the economy forward. So to help them to be more ambitious, to make even more money, which will put more people to work, he wanted the tax rate reduced, and it was to just 20%. Now, each time they made an additional dollar, they would only pay 20 cents on it. An important event that took place prior to Harding taking office and then Coolidge taking over was that the United States adopted the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which imposed prohibition, the banning of the production and sale of alcohol in the United States of America. Here you can see this newspaper headline from the time saying that the United States has voted dry. Dry was a slang term that they referred to a place where alcohol was prohibited. Prior to the passage of this amendment, this was a local decision. A state or a county or a city might decide to be dry, while places where alcohol was allowed would be described as being wet. Well, with the passage of the 18th Amendment, the entire country became dry. To enforce this amendment, Congress passed the National Prohibition Act, sometimes called the Volstead Act. Now, referring to this prohibition, or in other words, the banning of alcohol, then gave this constitutional period the nickname Prohibition. Now, anything can be prohibited. It just means to say that something can't be done. But in our national history, this word prohibition has become particularly associated with the elimination of the production of sale of alcohol. The 18th Amendment was ratified in 1920. In 1933, it would later be rescinded by another amendment to the Constitution. But during that 13-year period, the production and sale of alcohol was prohibited in the United States, and it was enforced through the National Prohibition Act, which attached criminal penalties to violating this constitutional passage. But that didn't mean that everyone went along with it. First of all, merely saying that you couldn't produce or sell alcohol didn't mean that you couldn't continue to consume it. If you had a stockpile in your basement, you could continue to drink through Prohibition. But once that was gone, then there were still ways to get it, illegal ways. Alcohol for human consumption was produced illegally, it was shipped in from other countries illegally, and then it was distributed through a series of secret bars, commonly known as speakeasies. They were called speakeasies because the way you would get into one is you would go up, rap on the door, having been told by somebody else that it was there. They'd slide open a little window, and you would speak easy through the window to convince the people inside that you weren't there to bust them for breaking the law, but you were there to come in and enjoy the alcohol with them. So these illegal liquor operations operated around the country too, throughout Prohibition. This may be another explanation for the character of the Roaring Twenties, where people wanted to go out and take chances. Think about it. If one of the primary leisure activities, drinking alcohol, has now been made illegal, and many people in the country go out and break the law in order to continue to enjoy it, this might cause a general attitude among them of trying new things, pushing limits, that sort of thing, which ends up being part of the characteristic of the Roaring Twenties. Later in the 1920s, a major presidential election was held between Herbert Hoover, the nominee of the Republican Party, and Al Smith, the nominee of the Democratic Party. Now, during this time period, most of the politicians that were running for president agreed on most things about how the country should be operated. So how would you choose if both political parties agreed on most issues? Well, there were some significant differences between these candidates. Herbert Hoover was a supporter of Prohibition, while Al Smith opposed it and thought that the 18th Amendment should be rescinded. But the more important issue may have been the fact that Al Smith was a Catholic. There was a distrust of Catholics in the United States of America among many people during this time period. It's because the Catholic Church has a pope at its head, and many people believe that if a person were elected president of the United States who was Catholic, rather than obeying the Constitution and laws of the United States, they would obey the instructions of the Pope, thus giving the Pope a sort of control over the United States of America. Well, with these sorts of issues in mind, that Al Smith was a Catholic that opposed Prohibition, the 1928 election ended up being an easy victory for Herbert Hoover, and he became president of the United States as the Roaring Twenties came to an end. The Roaring Twenties can be characterized as a time of a culture of consumption. Now, this term may be a little bit misleading, because any sort of business enterprise can be described usually as an act of consumption. You buy food to eat, you buy clothes to wear and eventually wear out. That's what we do when we buy things. We use them up eventually. But that isn't what's being referred to here. What's being referred to here is a transition where we as a society had become successful enough, industrious enough, industrialized enough, mechanized enough, that the bare necessities of life were available to most people, and they had some left over at the end. From their work, they could pay for enough food to eat, for clothes to wear, for a roof over their head, but they had extra money. So what to do with that extra money? This is where businesses started to sell to the general population things that they didn't really need, but you had to convince them somehow to actually buy them. So an opportunity to do this came in marketing your products to women. A woman named Christine Fredericks, a researcher and writer, wrote a very important book called Selling Mrs. Consumer in 1929, in which she argued that businesses should target women to get them to purchase these extra goods beyond what they needed. She pointed out that most household purchases, perhaps as many as 90%, were done by women. So if businesses wanted to make money, they needed to sell their products to women. One of the ways to do this was through the creation of department stores. Department stores are big stores that try to sell just almost a little bit of anything. Now, department stores are a dying breed in this country. They still exist, places like JCPenney, but other ones have gone out of business. But they came into existence during this time period. One of the big examples of this was the Marshall Field and Company, which was a department store in Chicago. What a department store does is it has a lot of different departments that sell different kinds of items. There might be a department for women's clothing. There might be another department for jewelry. There might be another department for housewares, another one for appliances, etc. So you could come in and do all your shopping about anything you wanted to shop for under one roof. But that wasn't in and of itself enough to get people to come there. Again, they're trying to appeal to women now. So they wanted to make it a glitzy, entertaining experience. They might have fancy windows outside to display items to try to attract people in. They also might have entertainment within the store itself, such as fashion shows and the like. They might provide babysitting for women that come in with their children so they can shop in peace, this sort of thing. This is an example of how marketing of products began to be oriented more toward female clients. Now, among the goods that they were trying to sell to people that they may not necessarily need were automobiles. But automobiles were relatively expensive. Now, when I say relatively expensive, in a moment I'm going to talk about the actual costs of some of them, and you'll see that they were inexpensive compared to today. But they were still a major purchase for many people, and they couldn't afford to buy an automobile by paying for it all at once. This led to the widespread use of buying on credit, where you could go into a place and purchase the automobile by making payments over time. This is eventually how other products would be sold too. By 1927, 60% of the autos being sold in the United States were being sold on credit. Other major purchases, such as appliance, could be done in this way too. It was a way to get the customers to buy the thing now, rather than having to save up to buy it later. This is part of these businesses who are producing more goods than are necessary, finding a way to sell them now. So a moment ago I said that automobiles were a major purchase. They were expensive for these people then, although not as expensive as they are now. Well, this slide shows the price of various brand new Ford motor cars. You can see that the lowest priced one is only $260. That'd be the equivalent of about $6,000 in our modern money. Still, a good chunk of money, but much cheaper than most cars being sold today. And this was intentional by Ford. Part of Ford's ideal for selling cars was to produce them so efficiently that he could sell them cheaply. He could sell them at a low enough price that the average American could buy them. In 1908, his primary model was the Model T, and he sold many, many of them to the American people. The best-selling car in the world at the time, because he made it affordable for average families to buy. Well, as a result of this, 80% of the cars being driven in the entire world by the end of the 1920s were being driven on American roads. Americans bought into this idea of buying cars and every family having one. This led to a car culture in the United States, where the design of towns, the design of roads, the design of life became centered around the fact that Americans own cars. We see that still to this day, where our big cities oftentimes don't emphasize things like public transportation. Instead, they emphasize building more and more roads so independent Americans with their own cars can go where they want. Well, this culture began in the 1920s as Americans used their extra money to go buy cars. The 1920s were also a time of a culture of escape. Now, what I mean by that is that people would look to entertainment as a way to escape the dreariness of their everyday lives. They might see the same people, not travel very far, not do many exciting things during most of their day, but they would have an opportunity through various entertainment outlets to imagine that they were talented or heroic or things like that, by putting themselves in the shoes of people that they saw or read about or viewed being those things. An example of this can be seen in the writings of the author Edgar Rice Burroughs, who produced a series of novels centering around a character called Tarzan. Tarzan was a man that was raised from a baby by apes in the African jungle and eventually became their leader. And Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote a series of novels from 1914 to 1939 that were bestsellers about the adventures of Tarzan. He cranked out a new novel almost every year. People gobbled these books up because they wanted to imagine themselves being in situations like that, living out in the jungle, managing to succeed, to become king of the apes, that sort of thing. It was exciting for them. It was so much different than the life they lived as drones in a factory working in the United States. This is what made things like this sell during this time period. And escapist entertainment continues to exist to this day as a way for people to step beyond their boring jobs and their average lives. Another kind of popular entertainment that grew up during this time period was auto racing. I told you just a moment ago that America became a land of cars. And once there were cars around, people started racing them. The most famous race was the Indianapolis 500, where cars would race for 500 miles around a track in Indianapolis. The winner in 1909, when the race was started, would receive $50,000 in prize money. Again, if we count for inflation, this is a purse of around $1 million for being the winner. This was big bucks and big entertainment for people to go see events like that, or listen to them on the radio, or whatever it may be, read about them in the newspaper. Again, it was imagining what it was like to drive so fast and be so talented to do it. It became a popular thing for people to enjoy. Perhaps the most transformative, though, the kind of entertainment that came along during this time period to help people escape were motion pictures. Now, motion pictures had been invented by Thomas Edison, and he had invented methods for projecting them to large audiences. But he couldn't make all the motion pictures that people were hungry to see himself with his own company. So other movie production companies sprung up, and they became centered in Hollywood, California. And there was good reason for this. The weather's wonderful in California. So if you're in a business where you can do it anywhere, why not do it in a place with great weather? But that weather also gave them opportunities for better filming. They could film outside and not be so worried about cold or rain. These Hollywood movie companies that sprung up were almost entirely run by Jewish executives. This is an interesting part of history. Matter of fact, most of them were either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants who had immigrated from Eastern Europe and then settled here, and they became movie moguls. An example of this is the Warner Brothers. These were four brothers who came to America, Jewish brothers, who immigrated from Poland. When they got to Ellis Island to come into the United States, the person who was processing couldn't figure out what their last name was as they tried to explain to him, so he just called him Warner, and they accepted that. This is actually a common thing for immigrants to do as they came through immigration. Whatever name they were assigned, they just took it. They were just glad to be in America. Well, the Warner Brothers moved to Hollywood and started a movie studio, and it became very popular. They were not the only Jewish movie producers. There were other studios started by Jewish people: Universal Studios, Paramount Studios, Columbia Pictures, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. These are companies that still exist today. This gave rise to the stereotypical idea that Hollywood is run by Jews, because it kind of was during this time period. Now, as they produced these movies and tried to make money off of them, they ended up arriving on a sort of golden formula to do so. They would produce pictures that would capture upper class audiences' interest by being glitzy, dramatic, over the top, with huge casts and big impressive sets, things like that. But they also wanted to tell stories that could capture the interest of more common folk, more conservative folks, people with traditional values. And so they realized the right combination was to tell big, dramatic, biblical stories. These became the biggest motion pictures of this time period. An example of this was the silent picture, The Ten Commandments, directed by a man named Cecil B. DeMille. He would later make a remake decades later in color, which is actually more famous today. But his original Ten Commandments was one that fit this pattern of doing a biblical story with an over-the-top production method. So it would appeal to more modern, more sophisticated audiences while appealing to traditional religious audiences too at the same time, and thus make a lot of money from both. Another very important film from this time period was The Jazz Singer, starring a man named Al Jolson. The Jazz Singer was based on the autobiography of Al Jolson. he became the most popular singer in America. And then he wrote a book about his life, which was then turned into a movie. Now, when the movie studio, Warner Brothers, decided to make this movie, they realized that it wouldn't do much good to make a movie about a singer if the audience couldn't hear him sing. So they invested technology to create talking pictures, as they were called, pictures with sound. Prior to this, motion pictures were silent. Now, along with the motion picture, there might be supplied a binder of sheet music for a piano. And you might have that in the theater, and someone would sit and play the piano while the motion picture played to provide a dramatic background element of music. Warner Brothers went farther. They made the playing of the music part of the film itself. Now, to do this, they had to develop new technology, not just for producing the film, but for distributing and showing the film. They custom fitted a couple of theaters that could play in sound, and it was a sensation. This led them on to make a lot of money off of motion pictures with sound. The value of Warner Brothers Company went from $5 million in 1925 to over $230 million in 1930. This shows how successful their move from silent pictures to sound was. And the first of the sound pictures was the jazz singer. Now, I have to point out one thing about the pictures on this slide, something that's considered quite offensive today, but was a common thing back then. Al Jolson, as I said, was a jazz singer. Jazz was a form of music that was developed in the black community. But then white listeners decided they liked it too, and some white singers took up singing jazz. Al Jolson was a sensation. He became the most popular singer in America as he sang jazz. But it was common for white jazz singers during this time period to dress up in blackface, to cover themselves to look like sort of a cartoonish version of a black man singing. Now, they didn't think of this as being offensive. For them, this was paying tribute to the origins of the music. This was black music, so they would dress up like they were black to perform it. But this is considered very offensive today for a white person to dress up in blackface. Nonetheless, it was common, and in the film itself, when Al Jolson sang, he performed in blackface. Another important figure from this time of film was Mary Pickford. It turned out that a majority of people who attended films were women, and so films were designed to cater to the interests of women. Now, we're talking about the idea of escapist entertainment, where people can imagine themselves in the story and for a few minutes escape their dreary lives by watching the film. Well, if a majority of the viewers of these films in theaters are women, then they'll want stories about women. Big dramatic stories, romantic stories that the women can see themselves in. Mary Pickford was the star of these kind of movies. She became known as America's sweetheart. She was a beautiful woman, but not too beautiful for other women to relate to. But then she ended up not just being influenced by the viewers of these films to become a big movie star, she ended up influencing them also. You can see in this picture of her wearing a knee-length dress. Remember, back in the time period preceding the Roaring Twenties, we had what was known as the Victorian time period, which has been discussed in previous chapters, named after the Queen of England during that time period, Queen Victoria. It was a time when women were expected to be prim and proper and dress conservatively and modest. So this is a break from this, as women went from ankle-length dresses to knee-length dresses. And one of the reasons they were influenced to do this is because they saw Mary Pickford on the movie screen dressing that way. This was a time period in which entertainment was brought also directly into people's homes through the invention of and eventually the widespread distribution of radio. Wireless radio was invented by an Italian, a man named Marconi, in 1901. Eventually it would be perfected enough that radios could be sold fairly cheap to common Americans. By the end of the 1920s, over 50% of households in America had radios, and families would gather around them to listen to music and dramatic programs. This is something that bound American culture together. This now gave a way for people all over the country to listen to the same music and hear the same stories told by actors at the same time. and thus become part of the same culture together. One of the common sorts of programs that was performed on radio was dramatic programs that became known as soap operas. These dramas about family intrigue and romance and things like that were particularly produced to be aired during the daytime. Now, who would be available to listen to a radio sitting in the living room at home during the daytime? It would be the woman of the house, who during this time period there was still the ideal that she should not work, that she should be at home, keeping a nice home for the family. So she'd be home cooking or cleaning during the day alone, and she would turn on the radio for entertainment. And there were programs that were designed to appeal to women. Then, during commercial breaks, that's how the programs were paid for. They would advertise goods and services that appealed to women, because that's who their listeners were during the daytime. So what is the woman at home doing? She's cleaning the house. So what might be appealing to her? A new kind of soap that will make her cleaning easier. So it was common for soap companies to sponsor these programs, and they became known as soap operas. Well, these sorts of programs that were on radio at this time, where the story continued from day to day to day, with characters all interacting and then eventually being replaced by other characters, but a continuous storyline, still happens today. There are soap operas on TV now during the day. And this is their original origin, these radio programs of the 1920s. Big broadcasting companies rose up to take advantage of the invention of radio. They were able to make programs that could be entertaining for people and distribute them all over the country through a network of affiliates. This led them to building radio towers all over the country, people buying radios to listen to the programs, and these big companies grew as centralized places where entertainment could be created and distributed to the masses. Two of these big companies were the Columbia Broadcasting System, known as CBS, and the National Broadcasting Company, known as NBC. These were companies that were created to broadcast radio programming around the country. Eventually, they would transition into television and still exist today as a couple of the big networks in television, CBS and NBC. Another form of entertainment that people greatly enjoyed during this time period was prize fighting, also known as boxing. It was called prize fighting because the fighters would fight and whoever won would get the prize money, get paid for the fight. The champion during this time period was a man named Jack Dempsey. He reigned as heavyweight champion from 1919 to 1926, and he was arguably the most popular athlete in America during the 1920s. He could get crowds that would pay over $1 million collectively to come in and see one of his fights live. His fights were also broadcast over the radio, so people over the country could hear in real time what was happening in the ring. And there's stories of people standing around and moving their bodies with each punch as they felt like they were there, even though they were just listening over the radio. Again, he is one of these heroes of this time of escapism, where people could imagine being an almost godlike figure like him who could defeat any other man in a battle of strength and fighting ability. Another great sports hero of this time was Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth came into baseball as both a pitcher and a hitter, but he ended up being so good at hitting that they ended up settling him in as having that as his exclusive role. From 1914 to 1935, he was the most amazing batter in baseball history. Prior to him coming into baseball, the record for the most home runs in the season was a couple dozen. He ended up hitting 50 or more in multiple seasons. It was unheard of. He hit more home runs by himself than entire teams did. He was such an amazing character that he became so well known that more people in America could identify him than could identify the President of the United States. Now, it's arguably true that Babe Ruth saved baseball. Why did he save baseball? It was because during the time period that he was a player that people just had to see because he was so amazing, baseball went through a scandal that could have potentially killed the sport. In 1919, the Chicago Black Sox agreed to purposefully lose the World Series. The World Series is the championship of baseball that comes at the end of the season. between two teams from the two rival leagues, the National League and the American League. The White Sox had agreed to throw the World Series, in other words, intentionally lose it, because gamblers had paid them to do so. The gamblers could put big bets on the other team and then pay members of the White Sox to intentionally lose so they could collect big money. Well, eventually this came out, and when it did, it was scandalous that people in baseball would take money to intentionally lose. People felt like they couldn't trust anything that was happening in the sports. Who else had been taking money? What results were because they were intentionally playing bad rather than playing good? This was a huge detriment to the sport, but Babe Ruth was there to keep people watching anyway. Another major sport that got its start during this time period was professional football. Professional football was limping along as a very minor sport that had a hard time making money before a man named Red Grange joined the Chicago Bears. Now, as I say, professional football was limping along. That doesn't mean that football itself was doing badly. Football was a popular sport and becoming more popular all the time as it was played by college teams. People hadn't accepted the idea of really watching professional football in large numbers until Red Grange, a college star, considered the best player in college football, suddenly left school to sign with the Chicago Bears as a professional football player. Then all those people who had wanted to follow Red Grange, to go in person to see what he was doing or listen to what he was doing over the radio, now wanted to follow professional football too because he was there. This was the birth of professional football becoming a major sport, and now today it is the biggest sport in America. Finally, one other heroic sort of thing from this era of escapism was perhaps the biggest singular event of the 1920s, and that was the solo flight of Charles Lindbergh across the Atlantic Ocean. Charles Lindbergh took off from New York City in 1927, and after more than 33 hours in the air landed in Paris, France. He flew by himself. They had to put so many gas tanks in his plane to get it there that he couldn't even see out the front windshield and had to look through a periscope to see where he was going. In that cold plane flying up high, he brought a bag of sandwiches with him to keep him fed and energized, but he had to stay awake for more than 33 hours straight to manually fly the plane. Didn't have autopilot back then. This is considered to the people at the time as one of the most amazing achievements any human had ever achieved. He became the hero from the era that people latched onto as almost a godlike figure that they could then escape into the life of as they imagined what it was like to fly across the Atlantic alone. The 1920s were also a time in which the role of women transitioned in American society. The 1920s gave rise to a certain sort of woman called a flapper, who dressed in a standard way and behaved in expected ways too. She was sort of the party girl of the time. She'd wear short skirts, she would go out to various clubs, she would smoke cigarettes that was kind of unheard of. The style of clothes was completely different than that it came before. She no longer had a corset cinched around her waist uncomfortably, instead she had clothes that allowed her to move about freely and easily. This attitude of the flappers caused them to want to explore new things in society and new areas where women could behave in ways that they had not before. This led to more sexual promiscuity, for example. The flappers were viewed by some people as an ideal. Others they were viewed as a scourge upon society. But it was a new outlet for women to behave in ways that they had not before in the conservative past. Women were also entering the workforce in greater numbers, particularly young women. They'd graduate from high school or graduate from college and go out and get a job for a few years before they found the right man and settled down and then maybe became a traditional mother. Well, during those years of freedom in their younger 20s, they would have to support themselves, so they'd go find jobs. Well, as these young women entered the workforce, certain professions became feminized. And what we mean by that is it became culturally associated with women. One was nursing, another one was teaching. But while women might dominate these particular professions, it doesn't mean that they could really move up in them. So look at the example, the picture on the right, a group of teachers. Do you notice a single man standing in the background? Well, here we have all the teachers at this school, and the man in the background is the principal. While women might dominate these professions, they would not dominate the managing of these professions for many years to come. Now, minority women also had to be in the workforce. It wasn't so much that they were looking for opportunities to make money to have fun like the flappers. Instead, it was oftentimes a necessity. Black Americans were at the bottom of the economic ladder, and oftentimes all members of the family might have to work to make ends meet. And the best opportunity for minority women, whether they be black or people of Mexican ancestry or whatever it may be living in the United States, the best opportunity for them to go find a job was in domestic service work, working as maids, for example, in a house. Here we see a group of minority women being trained in a vocational setting to go out and get jobs of this nature. Rather than leave them unemployed, services were provided to train them to go out and get the kind of jobs that they could actually get. During the 1920s, we also saw the rise of what became known as the new Negro Movement. Now, that word Negro is not one that we commonly use today, but it's how people that were black during this time period referred to themselves. Whites would oftentimes refer to them as colored, and that was a term that was used too. But blacks oftentimes referred to themselves as Negroes. Now, as the blacks moved into northern cities and established their own communities there, they were kind of free of the oppressive culture of the South, and they felt they had an opportunity to explore themselves culturally, to develop their own black culture within the United States. And as they did so, there was a flowering of their achievements, particularly in the arts, in music, writing, things like that. One of these black communities where this blossoming of black entertainment came was Harlem in New York City. Many blacks moved to New York City during the time of the First World War looking for work, and they ended up settling in neighborhoods together. One of these was Harlem, and this became a focal point for artists from the black community. Here we see a picture of black musicians as they developed, for example, the art form of jazz. Well, at the time, this transition in the black community, as they started having more artistic expression and celebrating their unique cultural contributions, was known among them at the time as the new Negro Movement. Looking back historically, we oftentimes more often refer to it as the Harlem Renaissance. That word Renaissance refers to a time of rebirth, where in a past time you had capacity to do certain things, and then for some reason you lost them, and then you come back to them again. That's what a Renaissance means. In the case of the black community, it's this idea that we had vibrant cultures while we were in Africa, or I should say while our ancestors were in Africa. But then what happened is they were captured and brought to America as slaves, and they lost their African cultures. Now we are building a new culture among ourselves as free black people in these northern cities in particular. As I said, this movement, this Harlem Renaissance, was not just limited to music, but it also involved other sorts of artists, including writers. The background photo here on this slide is a collection of prominent, successful authors in the black community during this time period. The most prominent and successful of them all was a man named Langston Hughes, who was a man who wrote novels, plays, and poems, and became quite popular. Now, the attitude that Langston Hughes had about his writing, which he had in common with many other black authors during the Harlem Renaissance, was to celebrate their unique culture, to give people who read his works a window into what it was like to be a person in the black community, both good and bad. Yes, he might talk about some of the oppression that blacks would experience, but he would also emphasize the joy that they felt through their artistic expression and the uniqueness of their own cultural community. An important place during the Harlem Renaissance was the Cotton Club, It was a place where musical performers could perform in Harlem during this time period. The Cotton Club is a reference to the past of some of the ancestors who lived in the South and picked cotton. Some of the greatest performers of the day, such as Duke Ellington, who was a band leader and composer, came to perform at the Cotton Club. This attracted audiences not just from the black community, but from the white community too. It's through things like this that parts of black culture, particularly the artistic parts, became popular all across America. Now, not all blacks were on the same page of what to do as a community, though. In a previous chapter, I talked about the debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Remember, Booker T. Washington had much more the attitude of we should improve ourselves and thereby give our white neighbors a reason to respect us better. That was his path out of the oppression that many blacks felt, was to just make such good use of their lives that whites would eventually accept them. W. Du Bois took a different point of view. He thought the blacks should be more aggressive, confronting the bad things that were done to them, calling them evil when they were evil, and in that way try to get whites to change and treat them for the better. Well, this man Marcus Garvey had a third way, and it became quite popular among some people, and it became known as Garveyism, and the followers of it became known as Garveyites. Well, what did Marcus Garvey want to do? He wanted blacks to become independent and self-sustaining. Kind of like with Booker T. Washington, he wanted them to find their best abilities and take advantage of them, to become the best, most industrious people that they could be. But that doesn't mean that he wanted to do it to make friends with whites. Instead, he was a separatist. He wanted blacks to go their own way. He wanted them to become so successful that they didn't need the white man anymore. Well, this was a controversial point of view to take, and this led to many people not liking Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey created an organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and published a newspaper called the Negro World to try to influence people to adopt his point of view. Now, it was somewhat successful, and he had a broader vision other than just helping Americans. He envisioned a Pan-Africanism. In other words, people of African descent all over the planet getting together and cooperating together in order to become free of white influence. He wanted these people to take pride in being black. This is one of the reasons on the previous slide you saw him dressed in a fancy military uniform. When people see a uniform like that, he believed, they immediately felt respect for the person wearing it. So one of the things that Garveyites would do is they would dress up in uniforms like that and march down the street together as a way to instill pride in themselves as black people. Well, this was what Garveyism was, and as I said, some people didn't like it. And so there was an active campaign among other people in the black community, became known as the Garvey Must Go campaign, where they literally wanted to get him out of the country. He was an immigrant from Jamaica. He had not been born and raised in the United States. And eventually, the Garvey Must Go campaign found a way to actually get rid of him. What they did was they ended up getting him convicted for a crime of mail fraud. This is where he had asked for money from people through the mail and then used the money for something else other than what they had given it for. That conviction led him to go to prison, and then after he finished his prison term, to being deported out of the United States. While that was maybe the end of Garveyism, it wasn't the end of separatism. There are still groups in the United States of America today, among black citizens, that have this idea that blacks should be independent and on their own. An example of this is the Nation of Islam that is still around in America today. So, while Garvey may have been run out of the country, his ideas weren't necessarily run out with him. There was also a culture war in the United States, overall, not just focusing in a minority community, but involving the white majority. And a story that provides a particular example of this can be seen on the next slide. That was the arrest and eventual execution of two Italians named Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vincente. These people were radicals. And what I mean by that is they were anarchists. They believed that government should be torn down because they were oppressive of common people. Now, what happened was that these brothers were accused of a crime of robbery and murder. There was little evidence that proved that they were the actual people involved. Nonetheless, they were arrested and they were convicted and they were sentenced to death. Many people in the Italian community thought that this was unjust. Activists around the world complained about it and petitioned the United States to set them free. Nonetheless, they were eventually executed. This is shown as an example where the fear of radicals was so great that the court system was willing to convict these people and eventually execute them with limited evidence that they had actually committed a crime. One of the brothers said that what they were really being punished for was being anarchists rather than murderers, and that could be true. So the United States had come up with its own sort of way of looking at politics and government and the world that was viewed as American. And we didn't want people like the Italian brothers there in the previous slide coming in and trying to mess it up. Matter of fact, Americans grew much more distrustful of immigrants coming into the country from anywhere. So in 1921, an Emergency Immigration Act was passed, and then it was made permanent by the National Origins Act in 1924. And what it did was it eliminated the amount of immigration that could come from any country. There was a formula for this. What they did was they looked at the number of immigrants from a particular country who had been relocated to America by 1920. And then what they did was, based on that number, they limited future immigration to 2% of that total from that group that was already here. So, for example, if there were 1 million Germans in the country in 1890, then if you only let 2 or 3% of that come in the future, then you're talking about just 20 or 30,000 Germans per year. So this puts a limitation on the number of immigrants, and there was a purpose for this. A purpose that some people might think is racist, but actually has some logic behind it. If you really want everybody in America to be Americans and have that common culture together, one of the things that prevents that from happening is when you have a continuous stream of immigrants from a particular place. So the immigrants that have been here longer might have been here long enough to potentially be completely adjusted to being Americans, like, for example, having picked up the speaking of English as their primary language. But that's probably not going to happen if they've constantly got friends and relatives coming into the country, fresh from their country of origin, who still speak that old native language. Then they'll want to continue to speak it too. They'll want to continue to engage in the culture of their home country that the new immigrants have brought with them. But if you cut off the flow of immigration, where there aren't constantly new people coming in with those old cultural traditions and values, then the people that are here, once they've been here long enough, they won't keep thinking of themselves as Germans or Italians or Irish. They'll just think of themselves as Americans. So if you really want a cultural group to integrate and become like everyone else, one of the best things you can do to make that happen is stop letting fresh immigrants come in from their home country. Another area of cultural conflict during this time period was the enforcement of the norms of Christianity. And this led to a branch of Christianity that's come to be known as Fundamentalist Christianity. An oil company, a group of oil company executives that were worth a lot of money, who were concerned about the degrading nature of Christianity, that it was getting away from its biblical roots, commissioned a minister named A.C. Dixon to write a series of books which became known as the Fundamentals, in which he argued for many of the basic doctrines of Christianity as being true, such as the creation through Adam and Eve, or the flood with Noah, or the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He argued that these should be interpreted as literal events from the Bible, and that the belief in them and the lessons learned from them was the fundamental nature of being a Christian. Now, it was felt that this was needed because there were pressures in society that were fighting against this, such as the science of Charles Darwin, which argued that there was a different way that humanity had come to existence through evolution rather than being created by God. So, this fundamentalist Christianity movement is then created to fight against those kinds of intrusions upon the belief systems of Christians. But not all Christians wanted to be fundamentalists. There were also a group of Christians that practiced a more liberal Christian theology. In other words, their beliefs were more politically liberal. They might deny or at least doubt some of the basic premises of the Christian religion, such as, for example, that Jesus Christ is a divine being who was resurrected. Now, a fundamentalist Christian would look at them and say, well, then you aren't really a Christian if you don't believe in Jesus. But their brand of Christianity might be built more around not what you believe, but what you do. So they might take the teachings of Jesus, whether he was the Son of God or not, and say he taught us to be good to the poor. So what I'm going to do as my Christianity is I'm going to set up a soup kitchen to feed poor people in the name of Jesus. That's a more liberal approach to Christianity. It's one that's not rooted necessarily in certain beliefs, but in certain actions. Now, the fundamentalist Christian critics of liberal Christianity said it was the road to atheism. That when you start doubting biblical truths, you'll just doubt one after another until you don't believe in anything anymore. So we had this conflict growing between liberal Christianity and fundamentalist Christianity. A place where the beliefs of Christians, the fundamental beliefs of Christians, was brought into public doubt was in a famous trial that took place during the 1920s, known as the Scopes monkey trial. It involved a teacher named John Scopes, who had chosen to teach the theory of evolution in his science class at school, even though it was prohibited by the laws of the state of Tennessee in which he lived. So he was arrested and charged with committing a crime. Well, his trial had attracted the attention, I should say his plight had attracted the attention of the American Civil Liberties Union. They wanted to use him as a public demonstration of the problems with education and religion being mixed. So they convinced him to challenge what he had been accused of, but then in the trial actually admit of it. They just wanted the parties arguing. So they went out and found a high-power attorney to represent Scopes, a man named Clarence Darrow, considered to be one of the best lawyers in America. Well, then the prosecution that was trying to throw him in jail for teaching evolution went out and got their own famous attorney, a man named William Jennings Bryan, the famous presidential candidate on multiple times for the Democratic Party, who had given the Cross of Gold speech against the gold standard. Well, by this time, William Jennings Bryan is an old man, not nearly as effective as he had once been. And in the trial, Clarence Darrow dominates him. William Jennings Bryan even volunteers to get on the stand as a supposed witness about biblical teachings, and Clarence Darrow proceeds to catch him in contradictions. So in the end, John Scopes was found guilty of teaching evolution because he admitted to doing it, which broke the law. But as the trial got reported around the country, it actually made more people sympathetic to his cause than against it because of the performance of the lawyers in the trial. The last topic in this chapter is the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan had come into existence during Reconstruction after the Civil War as a way for men to go out, primarily men, although women joined it too, to go out and secretly, in disguise, fight against as what they saw the inappropriate releasing of black people to become the social equivalents of whites by the end of slavery. They would go around and they would intimidate black folks, for example, into not voting, even though the Constitution allowed them to. Now, this was done in secret. They wore hoods, they would go out in the dark of night, because when they first started organizing, the South was still occupied by Union armies. And so if they got caught, they could be arrested for what they were doing. Well, eventually, after Reconstruction ended and the white majority got back power over the state governments, many of the things that the KKK had been trying to accomplish by riding around in the night were instead accomplished in public by those who were making the laws in the state, such as, for example, the pressure on black voters not to vote through things like literacy tests and poll taxes and things like that. That was done out in the open now. You didn't need the KKK running around in secret to do it. So the KKK faded nearly away in the years after Reconstruction. Well, that eventually changed when the movie The Birth of a Nation was shown in 1915 in theaters all over the country. The heroes of this film were the Ku Klux Klan. It was a retelling of Southern history, the Ku Klux Klan not as villains out harassing black people, but rather as the heroes who prevented white women from being taken advantage of by black men. Now, this movie got a lot of attention around the country, not just because of the story, which seemed to rehabilitate the Ku Klux Klan, but also because of its production values. It was the biggest, most elaborate movie filmed to that date. It was like a giant Marvel picture in the context of today. And so people from all over the country went to see it, and they saw the Ku Klux Klan portrayed as heroes. This then led to a rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan under a man named Colonel William Joseph Simmons. He went out and actively tried to establish Klan chapters around the country. Now, not as singularly a racist group to harass blacks, but more as a social club where people could come and meet together with other like-minded people to defend the country against a host of seen enemies. This might be, for example, the sexual liberation of women through the flapper movement of the 1920s, or the influence of Catholics over cities when they were viewed as being loyal to the Pope. It also might include blacks and Mexicans and things like that who were seen as having values that were contrary to the values of white Americans. Whatever the issue might be, from atheists to Jews to immigrants, whatever, things that they saw that were in conflict with the traditional societal view of America, they fought against. This allowed them to spread to states all around the country, even those without large black populations, such as my home state of Oregon, where the Ku Klux Klan flourished for a time. This second Klan was an all-purpose defender of American virtue and values. At least that's how they saw themselves. But many of their methods were those in line with the old Ku Klux Klan. They would still go out and potentially lynch and kill people that they saw as particularly problematic for them defending American values. They would burn crosses as a way to intimidate other people. They would still go out night riding like their predecessors during the time of Reconstruction, where they would go out and harass people in the dark of night, show up with their hoods so they couldn't be identified, and threaten them with severe consequences if they didn't comply with the dominant culture. So in this way, the Klan had an influence on the development of America during this time period too. And that is the end of this chapter.